Garnish's expression suggested that he had not, in fact, wanted Whimsy to say anything at all, and that he particularly resented being told he'd presented them with an elegant problem. Nevertheless, there was little choice but to proceed. The inspector led Whimsy through a preliminary tour of the house, with the air of a man exhibiting taxidermied specimens, pausing at each doorway to deliver facts in a monotone that might have been engineered specifically to induce unconsciousness. The library occupied the eastern wing of the ground floor, accessible only through the main corridor or via French doors that opened onto the garden. Those doors, Garnish reported with grim satisfaction, had been locked from within as well. The windows, which were tall sash affairs typical of the period, had been painted shut some decades prior, probably during the tenure of the previous owner, and bore no marks consistent with recent disturbance. The room itself was precisely the sort of space one might expect a retired merchant to favor: leather-bound volumes arranged according to no discernible system, a marble fireplace containing the remnants of a fire that had burned out entirely, and scattered throughout various surfaces an impressive collection of those small objects that accumulate in the homes of the wealthy and aimless: jade figurines, carved chess pieces, a particularly revolting paperweight fashioned from what appeared to be compressed butterfly wings. The housekeeper, Mrs. Creel, discovered him at approximately 8 o'clock this morning, Garnish continued, consulting his notebook as though it might reveal information he hadn't already committed to memory. She arrived to open the curtains, her usual routine, and found the door locked. She attempted to open it, receiving no response, and accordingly summoned Cook, who fetched the boy, who fetched her nephew who works at the post office. The nephew broke the lock, finding our victim precisely as you see him now. The cocoa, according to Mrs. Creel, was not there when she left the house yesterday evening at 6:30. She locked the front door at that time, being the last member of staff to depart. Mr. Ashford had taken his dinner at 7 o'clock, mutton broth and cold fish, which Mrs. Creel prepared before leaving, and had settled himself in the library with his usual glass of port and some correspondence. Whimsy moved closer to the corpse, examining it with the dispassionate interest one might bring to a particularly troublesome piece of machinery. The face was indeed an alarming shade of blue-gray, the lips distinctly cyanotic, and yet there were no obvious marks of violence, no contusions, no signs of struggle, no foam upon the lips or other indicators of convulsive death. The hands lay peacefully in the lap, the fingernails bearing no evidence of having clawed at anything in the final moments. Whimsy reached out and touched the back of the neck, then the wrist, noting the degree of rigidity and the temperature with the precision of a man inspecting a racehorse. "How long precisely did the doctor estimate the death had occurred?" he asked, straightening. "Between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning," Garnish repeated with obvious frustration, "which is rather broader than one might prefer. But the doctor was quite firm that the degree of rigor and the ambient temperature of the room rendered greater precision impossible. Ashford was evidently a man who preferred his domestic spaces rather warm. The fire had been recently lit, judging from the ash residue." "Curious," Whimsy murmured, more to himself than his companion. "The fire being out. Entirely, you understand, yet the room retaining sufficient warmth to affect the rate of post-mortem change. One wonders what precisely kept it at such a steady temperature through the night." He turned his attention to the cup, inhaling carefully without touching it. "And the cocoa. Did no one observe the victim preparing this beverage? Surely Mrs. Creel would have remarked upon it if he had rung for assistance." "There's no bell pull in this room," Garnish said, and for the first time a note of something approaching defensiveness crept into his voice. The Ashfords kept servants in that era when bells weren't deemed necessary. A man was expected to manage his own small comforts. Besides, Mrs. Creel insists she heard nothing unusual after she departed. She lives in Cottage 3, which adjoins this property, and her window faces the back garden. She would certainly have noticed any commotion. Whimsy moved to the French doors, examining the lock with meticulous care. It was an old mechanism, the sort that would require no small amount of force to break open, and yet it showed no signs of recent tampering. The paint around the frame appeared undisturbed, and the dust upon the sill lay in patterns that suggested undisturbed repose of considerable duration. He pressed his palm against the glass, feeling the faint chill that indicated the panes had remained closed throughout the night. The garden beyond was sufficiently overgrown to suggest that Ashford had not been a man of horticultural enthusiasms. Wild roses tangled with what appeared to be several varieties of unidentifiable weeds, and a small orchard in the distance bore that slightly melancholy appearance of fruit trees past their productive prime. "I believe," Wimsey said at length, turning back to face Garnish with an expression of elaborate thoughtfulness, "that we ought to conduct interviews with the household. Mrs. Creel first, I think, and then the cook. I should like to know, among other matters, what precisely was served for dinner yesterday, whether Mr. Ashford had mentioned any unusual circumstances or visitors, and whether anyone observed him consuming anything whatsoever after his meal. I should also, if it is not imposing too greatly upon your generosity, rather like to examine his correspondence. Merchants, in my experience, retain a curious habit of recording all manner of useful information in their letters: debts, grievances, anticipated events, and other such mundanities that often prove remarkably illuminating. Mrs. Creel proved to be a woman of approximately 60 years, possessed of that particular brand of respectability that comes from decades of service in genteel households. She received Wimsey in the morning room with an expression compounded of grief, indignation, and a faint suspicion that the entire affair was somehow a deliberate breach of her own professional standards. She was, she informed him with considerable emphasis, an experienced housekeeper of unimpeachable character, and Mr. Ashford had been a most particular gentleman who had never, in her recollection, occasioned any sort of scandal or impropriety. This last observation seemed directed at Wimsey himself, as though she suspected him of harboring doubts about her late employer's moral rectitude. He was a quiet sort of gentleman. Mrs. Creel continued, twisting her handkerchief into increasingly desperate configurations. Kept to himself mostly after Mrs. Ashford passed. Had his habits, as gentlemen do, his port at 8 o'clock, his correspondence after dinner, his cocoa before retiring. Regular as clockwork, Mr. Ashford was. Never a word of complaint, never demanded anything unreasonable, paid fair wages, didn't meddle with the running of the kitchen, and treated the staff with that so. Arty of distant courtesy that marks a person of breeding. And yesterday evening, Wimsey prompted, settling himself into a chair with the air of a man prepared for a lengthy conversation, he observed these habits precisely as always. He took his dinner at 7, his port at 8, and then settled himself in the library with his correspondence. That's correct, sir. I prepared the meal myself. Mutton broth, cold fish, a small portion of cheese, and some bread. Cook had made a syllabub for pudding, but Mr. Ashford said he had no appetite for such things. He took only the savoury course and his port. I cleared away at 7:30 and left the house at 6:30, as I always do on a Friday. Cook and the boy had departed earlier, Cook at 5 o'clock and the boy at 4. We're all accustomed to having Friday evenings to ourselves, and Mr. Ashford had never objected to being alone in the house. Did he mention expecting any visitors, or did you observe any callers during the day? Mrs. Creel's expression became, if possible, even more guarded. There was a gentleman called in the afternoon. Around 3 o'clock it would have been. I didn't observe him myself, but Cook mentioned it. A well-dressed gentleman, she said, quite insistent about speaking to Mr. Ashford privately. They were closeted in the library for perhaps 40 minutes, and then the gentleman departed. Cook said Mr. Ashford seemed rather preoccupied after the visitor left, but that was nothing unusual. He was often preoccupied. This information, Wimsey noted with interest, had not featured in Garnish's preliminary account. He made a mental note to question the inspector more pointedly regarding the various gaps in his investigation, though he maintained an expression of polite unconcern. And this gentleman, did Cook describe him in any greater detail? His age, his appearance, any distinguishing chara? Touristics? A tall gentleman, Cook said, with dark hair greying at the temples. Well spoken, she thought, though he had a slight accent of some sort. She couldn't determine precisely what. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm, which led her to suppose he was a solicitor or perhaps a businessman of some description. She didn't catch his name. He announced himself as Mr. Ashford's solicitor, but Cook is inclined to mishear things, and she may have misunderstood. Whimsy rose and moved to the window, observing the overgrown garden beyond with an expression of idle contemplation. "This cocoa, Mrs. Creel. Mr. Ashford's bedtime cocoa." "Who typically prepared it?" "Cook usually left it ready on the cooker before she departed, sir. Mr. Ashford would brew it himself when he was ready for bed. It was a matter of some delicacy with him. He preferred it quite hot and with a particular proportion of milk to cocoa powder. He didn't care for anyone else interfering with the preparation." "And yesterday evening, was the cocoa left ready as usual?" There was a pause, barely perceptible, but to Whimsy's trained ear quite unmistakable. Mrs. Creel's fingers twisted the handkerchief with renewed vigor. "Cook said she left it prepared, sir. She was quite certain of it." "But—" Mrs. Creel hesitated, seeming to struggle with some internal conflict. "But now that I think upon it, it does seem rather odd. The cup that was found beside Mr. Ashford, it was his best cup, the Spode china that he kept in the display cabinet in the morning room. Cook never used the good china for bedtime cocoa. Never. She always used the plain white cups from the kitchen. Mr. Ashford was most particular about such distinctions." This observation hung in the air between them like a particularly odious smell. Whimsy turned from the window, his expression having taken on that quality of intense but carefully mass. Ked interest that those familiar with him had learned to recognize as the harbinger of active cerebration. "That is most interesting indeed, Mrs. Creel. Most interesting. I wonder whether the inspector has yet examined the kitchen to determine the condition of the cocoa that Cook left prepared. And more particularly, whether anyone has thought to ask whether the cocoa remaining in the pot bears any resemblance whatsoever to the cocoa consumed by Mr. Ashford prior to his untimely demise." He paused, allowing this observation to settle into Mrs. Creel's consciousness. "I think perhaps we shall need to speak with Cook next. And following that, I should very much like to examine Mr. Ashford's correspondence, and indeed the entire contents of his desk. There is, I suspect, a good deal more to this matter than the simple fact of a locked room and a man who ceased, somewhat inconveniently, to maintain the habit of breathing. Wouldn't you agree? Cook, when Whimsy was eventually brought to the kitchen, proved to be a woman of considerably more volatile temperament than her senior colleague. She was perhaps 55 years of age, possessed of that particular combination of stoutness and indignation that marks those accustomed to being the unquestioned authority within their domain, and she seemed to regard Whimsy's presence in her kitchen as a personal affront of the highest order. She was engaged in the preparation of lunch, a process that involved a good deal of aggressive chopping and the occasional muttered imprecation directed at the general incompetence of the world at large. "I left the cocoa prepared, I did," she announced before Whimsy had even properly introduced himself, wielding her knife with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of an executioner. "Left it simmering gentle-like on the back of the cooker, same as always, and I used the plain white cup. From the second shelf, the one Mr. Ashford preferred for his bedtime beverage. I'm not so foolish as to use the good china for such a purpose. That Spode set was for display, not for drinking from." "And you are quite certain of this?" Whimsy inquired, settling himself upon a stool with the air of a man prepared for a lengthy interrogation. "You actually observed yourself placing the cocoa in the plain white cup before leaving the house?" Cook's knife paused mid-chop. "Well," she said, with a slightly defensive tone of someone whose certainty has been unexpectedly questioned, "I prepared it and left it on the cooker. The cup was ready beside it. I didn't actually see Mr. Ashford drink it, if that's what you're implying." "I am implying nothing whatsoever," Whimsy assured her. "I am merely establishing facts with as much precision as possible." "You prepared the cocoa at what time precisely?" "At 4:45, when I was finishing the day's work. I always prepared it then, so it would be ready and warm when Mr. Ashford desired it. He usually took it around 9 or 10 o'clock, after his correspondence. That was his habit. And the pot in which you prepared this cocoa, where is it now?" Cook gestured vaguely toward the cooker. "I washed it up this morning, same as always. It's in the cupboard where it belongs." Whimsy rose and examined the kitchen with the careful attention of an archaeologist surveying ancient ruins. It was, he had to admit, a remarkably well-ordered space, everything arranged with the sort of systematic precision that marks a professional of genuine competence. He located the plain white cups on the second shelf of the dresser, observed them to be of modest manufacture but perfectly serviceable, and then turned his attention to the larger question of the cooker itself. It was a gas stove of relatively modern vintage, well-maintained but not ostentat. Icily new. The burners bore the faint scorch marks of long use, and the surface was scrupulously clean. This cooker, Whimsy said thoughtfully, would maintain a temperature of perhaps 140 degrees Fahrenheit on the back burner for an extended period, would it not? Sufficient to keep cocoa warm without actually boiling it further? That's the idea, Cook confirmed, her suspicion of him seeming to intensify. Keep it warm, but not scalding. Mr. Ashford preferred it that way. And you departed the house at 5 o'clock yesterday evening, leaving the cocoa prepared and the cooker alight? There was a pause that suggested Cook was considering the implications of this question with some care. Yes, she said finally. But Mr. Ashford knew not to leave the cooker burning indefinitely. He was a careful gentleman in such matters. He would extinguish it once he'd taken his drink. Presumably, Whimsy agreed, though it occurs to me that if the cocoa had been left upon the cooker from 5 o'clock in the evening until midnight or thereabouts, it would have become somewhat concentrated, would it not? The water content would have evaporated to a considerable degree, and the flavor would have become quite intensified. Cook's expression suggested this observation had not previously occurred to her, and that she resented Whimsy for introducing it into her consciousness. I suppose it might have, she admitted grudgingly. Whimsy moved to the cupboard where the cocoa tin was stored, a modest container bearing the label of a reasonably respectable brand, and examined it with the air of a man studying something of profound significance. And you are certain this is the cocoa you used yesterday? Of course I'm certain. I buy the same brand every week from Higgins's shop in the village. Same amount, same supplier. Mr. Ashford was particular about such things. Why? Mezzy found most interesting was not what Cook said, but rather what she seemed reluctant to say. There was a tightness around her mouth, a certain guardedness in her expression that suggested she was withholding something of significance. He did not, however, press the matter. Instead, he thanked her courteously for her cooperation, complimented her on the evident order of her kitchen, and requested permission to examine the cocoa pot that she had washed and put away. The pot, when retrieved from the cupboard, was entirely unremarkable. A modest saucepan, of the sort found in 10,000 kitchens throughout England, bearing no distinguishing marks and showing no signs of anything other than the thorough cleaning it had received that morning. Whimsy held it up to the light, sniffed it carefully, and then turned it over in his hands with the concentrated attention usually reserved for objects of significant antiquity. One final question, he said at length. Yesterday afternoon, before you departed the house, did you observe any callers? A tall gentleman with dark hair graying at the temples, perhaps carrying a leather portfolio? Cook's face underwent a peculiar transformation, cycling rapidly through surprise, calculation, and something approaching fear. The solicitor fellow, she said quietly. I heard him arrive, and I heard him leave, but I didn't see him myself. I was in the scullery, scrubbing vegetables. Heard the bell ring, heard footsteps in the hall. He was with Mr. Ashford in the library for a time, then he left. That was all. And Mr. Ashford seemed distressed by the visit? Preoccupied, Cook said. Not distressed exactly, just preoccupied. As though something the gentleman said had set him thinking about matters he'd rather not contemplate. The library, revisited in the context of this new information, presented itself to Whimsy in an altogether different light. He stood before the desk, a handsome mahogany affair of considerable age, arranged with the meticulous order of a man for whom system and propriety were matters of genuine importance, and began to examine the correspondence with the focused intensity of a scholar deciphering ancient manuscripts. Garnish hovered at his elbow with the air of a man who suspects he is about to be made to look foolish. which, Whimsy reflected, was probably a justified concern. The papers arranged upon the desk were, for the most part, precisely what one might expect: bills from various tradesmen, a letter from a solicitor regarding some minor property matter, several notices from his bank, and a number of communications from his nephew in London regarding certain financial arrangements. It was the drawer, however, the small locked drawer in the left-hand side of the desk, that commanded Whimsy's attention. He produced a delicate implement from his waistcoat pocket, examined the lock with the air of a man assessing a particularly interesting puzzle, and opened it with a deliberate click that caused Garnish to draw in his breath rather sharply. "I say," the inspector protested, "we haven't obtained a warrant for—" "My dear Garnish," Whimsy interrupted, withdrawing a bundle of letters bound with faded ribbon, "we are engaged in investigating a death that occurred under circumstances sufficiently irregular to merit the suspension of the more tedious conventions. I suspect that if the late Mr. Ashford were consulted on the matter, he would raise no objections whatsoever. Indeed, the state of his current condition rather precludes his raising objections to anything whatsoever. The letters proved illuminating in ways both obvious and subtle. They were correspondence dating back approximately 15 years, written in a feminine hand of considerable elegance, and they spoke with a cant that suggested a relationship of far greater intimacy than anything the respectable facade of Ashford's life would have indicated. The earliest letters were dated 1909 and originated from an address in Kensington, signed with a name, Margaret, that appeared nowhere else in Ashford's documented life. The tone of these communications progressed from passionate affection through something approaching desperation, and finally to a resigned sadness that was, Whimsy found, considerably more affecting than the earlier expressions of romantic ardor. "My dear Richard," one letter, dated 1918, read, "I understand that you have made your choice, and I shall respect it. Perhaps it is better this way. I am not, and never have been, suitable for the position you occupy in the world. My family background, my circumstances, all would reflect upon your reputation in ways neither of us could countenance. I only ask that you remember, when you are settled in your respectable life with a respectable woman, that there was once someone who loved you without reservation or calculation. I shall not trouble you further after this letter. The annuity you have so generously provided will permit me to live modestly but without want, and that is more than I could have asked. Burn this letter, should you wish to. I will understand. Your affectionate Margaret." Subsequent letters became increasingly infrequent, until they ceased entirely around 1922. The final letter, however, dated 1924 and written in a shakier hand, suggested a renewal of contact, and this one was far shorter and considerably more urgent in tone. "Richard, I must speak with you on a matter of some importance. It concerns something you believed settled long ago. Please respond by return of post. I would not write with a matter not of genuine gravity. M." Whimsy set down the letters with the careful precision of a man handling relics of considerable fragility. He was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, before he turned to Garnish with an expression of elaborate innocence. "I wonder," he said at length, "whether the inspector might inquire as to the identity and current whereabouts of the gentleman who called yesterday afternoon. A tall gentleman with dark hair graying at the temples, possessed of a slight accent and carrying a leather portfolio. I suspect he might prove most illuminating regarding the circumstances that brought him to Orchard Lane House at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, at a time when the household was otherwise occupied." Garnish, who had been reading the letters over Whimsy's shoulder with mounting discomfort, looked up sharply. "You think he's connected to the death?" "I think," Whimsy corrected, settling himself in the leather chair that had so recently cradled Ashford's corpse, a proceeding that Garnish seemed to find mildly obscene, "that the gentleman in question is very likely connected indeed. The question that exercises my mind at present is not whether he visited, but rather why his visit should have occasioned such distress to Mr. Ashford as to result in the consumption of something rather more substantial than cocoa at an unusual hour. It strikes me as significant that a man of such regular habits should deviate from his routine in such a marked manner. People do not, in my experience, abandon their established patterns without compelling reason. You think the visitor poisoned him? Garnish asked, with the eager tone of a man grasping at a solution that presents itself as acceptably straightforward. I think nothing of the sort, Wimsey corrected, with a shade of asperity. If the visitor had intended Ashford's demise, he would scarcely have accomplished it through the medium of cocoa consumed in a locked room under circumstances specifically designed to prevent external interference. No, Garnish. I suspect the truth is considerably more complex and considerably more interesting. But to determine that truth, we must first establish precisely who this mysterious solicitor was, what business brought him to this house, and what he said during his 40-minute interview with the deceased. I suggest you endeavor to locate him with some urgency. His appearance, his accent, his leather portfolio. These are details sufficiently specific that the village ought to yield information as to his identity with reasonable dispatch. The village of Ashford in the Weald, it transpired, was possessed of that particular quality of provincial life wherein absolutely nothing of consequence occurred without the entire community becoming aware of it within the space of approximately 2 hours. The tall gentleman with the dark hair graying at the temples had, according to the postmistress, who seemed to regard the dissemination of information as her primary civic duty, arrived by the 2:15 train from London and had taken a taxi, the only taxi in the village, driven by one Tommy Wickham, whose mother was the second cousin of the vicar's wife, directly to Orchard Lane House. He had remained for approximately 3/4 of an hour, during which time the taxi had waited patiently outside the gates, its driver engaging in that particular form of patient observation that taxi drivers everywhere perfect to an art form. Upon emerging, the gentleman had instructed Wickham to convey him to the railway station, where he had taken the 4:10 train back to London, bound, according to the booking clerk, for Victoria. Wickham, when located and persuaded to part with his recollections, proved to be a man of approximately 40 years, possessed of that particular combination of deference and cynicism that marks those accustomed to trance, orting strangers through the countryside. He confirmed that the gentleman had been a bit of a toff, spoke with what he described as one of them foreign accents, French-like, or maybe Russian, and had seemed rather preoccupied during the journey. Kept looking at his watch, Wickham reported, as though he was worried about missing his train. Didn't say much of anything, just stared out the window. But I'll tell you what struck me as odd. When he was getting out of the taxi, his hands were shaking. Proper trembling they were, as though he'd had a shock of some kind. Wimsey, who had insisted on accompanying Garnish during these inquiries, listened to this account with the concentrated attention usually reserved for matters of significant philosophical import. They were, at present, seated in the parlour of the post office, surrounded by shelves of tinned goods and various pharmaceutical preparations of dubious efficacy, while the postmistress, a Mrs. Hallowell of approximately 65 years, whose expression suggested she had never heard of the concept of privacy, provided them with additional intelligence regarding the mysterious visitor. He had a leather portfolio, Mrs. Hallowell confirmed, leaning forward with the air of imparting information of tremendous consequence. Quite a substantial one it was, the sort a gentleman in business might carry. And his suit was good quality. I know quality when I see it, my late husband being in the tailoring trade, but it wasn't new. He was wearing it with the sort of care a man might if he was conscious of making a particular impression. There's a way about people, you understand, when they're wearing something they've selected specifically to represent themselves in a certain light. And you observed no identifying marks upon the portfolio? Wimsey inquired. No initials, no firm name, nothing whatsoever that might indicate his profession or identity. Mrs. Hallowell's expression suggested she was disappointed by the specificity of his question. Nothing that I could see from a distance, sir. But then I wouldn't have examined it closely. That would have been improper. Wimsey exchanged a glance with Garnish that was charged with meaning the inspector seemed disinclined to acknowledge. Garnish, he said at length, I think we must telegraph to Scotland Yard and request that they make inquiries regarding any gentleman of foreign extraction, Russian or French accent, who have visited the area recently on business matters. Additionally, I should like to know whether there have been any communications between Ashford and London in the past 6 months that might indicate anticipated visitors or expected correspondence of significance. You think he's a criminal? Garnish asked hopefully. Some sort of blackmailer, perhaps, come to extract payment from Ashford for past indiscretions? I think, Whimsy corrected, that he is someone who possessed information of sufficient consequence to cause Ashford considerable distress. Whether that information pertains to criminal activity, romantic entanglement, financial impropriety, or some other matter entirely remains to be determined. What interests me most profoundly is not the identity of the visitor himself, but rather the subsequent actions of Mr. Ashford. A man receives a shock, or perhaps a revelation, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. By midnight or thereabouts he is dead, having consumed something that has rendered him unable to continue his engagement with existence. The question that demands answering is whether those two events are connected through the agency of a third party, or whether they represent a sequence of cause and effect initiated by Ashford's own conscious decision. They returned to Orchard Lane House as the afternoon light began to acquire that peculiar golden quality that precedes the descent into evening. The corpse had been removed for post-mortem examination, a procedure that would, Whimsy suspected, yield results of considerably greater clarity than the preliminary assessment had suggested. Whimsy made directly for the library and settled himself once more in the leather chair, closing his eyes and remaining absolutely motionless for a period of approximately 5 minutes. When he opened them again, his expression had undergone a subtle alteration, becoming more focused, as though some internal calculation had reached its conclusion. "The window," he said suddenly, rising and moving to the French doors. "Tell me precisely, Garnish, what you observed regarding the window frame and the paint that seals it shut." Garnish, looking mildly affronted at being addressed in such a peremptory fashion, nevertheless moved to join him. "As I said, it's been painted shut for decades. No way it could have been opened without leaving unmistakable traces. And yet," Whimsy murmured, running his finger along the junction between the frame and the sill with meticulous care, "paint, however ancient, does chip and wear. Particularly if one is not overly concerned with leaving obvious evidence of disturbance. The question that now occupies my mind is not whether the window could have been opened, but rather whether someone, at some point in the past 2 years or so, had done precisely that. The post-mortem examination, conducted by a doctor, Hartley, who arrived from the county town with the air of a man who had better things to do with his time, proved to be considerably more illuminating than the preliminary inspection had suggested. The contents of Ashford's stomach revealed traces of cocoa, certainly, but also something else, a substance that Dr. Hartley identified with cautious precision as bearing the characteristics of a particular variety of oleander extract, a compound that would produce the symptoms observed, the cyanosis, the apparent asphyxiation, the peaceful final posture that suggested the victim had been unaware of the exact manner in which death was approaching. More significantly, however, the toxin had been administered in such a dosage as to suggest neither accident nor impulsive homicide, but rather a carefully calculated quantity designed to produce death within a specific window of time, somewhere between 2 and 4 hours after ingestion, Dr. Hartley reported, settling himself in the morning room with a cup of tea that cook had prepared with considerably more gentleness than her usual manner seemed to permit. The body's response would have been relatively gradual, a sense of confusion, perhaps some difficulty with respiration, but nothing so violent as to produce conscious alarm or physical struggle. The victim would have remained in his chair, growing progressively weaker, until the moment of death itself, which would have appeared, to the casual observer, to be little more than the natural conclusion of sleep. Whimsy received this information with the expression of a man whose suspicions have been substantially confirmed, though not in the manner he might have anticipated. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the overgrown garden with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something far more significant than merely unkempt vegetation. And the oleander extract itself. Would such a substance be readily available to the average person, or would its acquisition require specialist knowledge or access to particular resources? Oleander is a common garden plant, Dr. Hartley replied. Quite decorative, actually, with rather lovely pink or white flowers. The extract would be relatively simple to prepare for anyone with basic botanical knowledge. The leaves, when dried and steeped, yield a potent toxin. A child with access to the right information could produce it. This observation hung in the air between them with the weight of genuine significance. Whimsy turned back to face the assembled company. Garnish, Dr. Hartley, and the local constable who had been maintaining a presence throughout the investigation with the helpful contribution of someone whose primary function was to prevent unauthorized persons from disturbing the crime scene. I wonder, Whimsy said thoughtfully, whether anyone has thought to examine the grounds of Orchard Lane House with an eye toward identifying the presence of oleander plants. They are, I am given to understand, rather distinctive in appearance, and not the sort of flora one might expect to find in an English garden of this vintage. It was Garnish, rather to his credit, who immediately grasped the significance of this suggestion. Within the hour, a thorough examination of the garden had been conducted, and it was the boy, the one responsible for rough work about the property, who discovered in a sheltered corner adjacent to what had once been a cutting garden 3 oleander plants in considerable bloom, their pink flowers offering a peculiar contrast to the wild roses and tangled vegetation that characterized the majority of the garden. They were, upon closer inspection, approximately 2 years old, having been deliberately cultivated in a manner that suggested someone with I see horticultural intent. Mr. Ashford never planted nothing ornamental, the boy reported, a lad of perhaps 17 with the sort of transparent honesty that marks those unaccustomed to dissimulation. He said flowers was a waste of good gardening space. These were here when I came to work last summer, already established like. I never thought nothing about them, but they're strange plants for a gentleman like Mr. Ashford to have encouraged. Whimsy examined the plants with the concentrated attention usually reserved for matters of profound archaeological significance. The soil around them was well tended, the plants themselves healthy and vigorous, bearing no signs of neglect. Someone had been maintaining them with deliberate care, watering them during dry spells, removing dead flowers to encourage continued blooming, even providing them with what appeared to be occasional applications of fertilizer. This was not the work of a man indifferent to horticulture, nor was it the casual preservation of an existing feature. This was cultivation with purpose. Garnish, Whimsy said at length, I believe we must now direct our inquiries toward Mr. Ashford's nephew and niece. The mysterious visitor from London may provide certain answers, but I suspect the true key to this affair lies rather closer to home. Specifically, I should like to know whether either of these heirs had visited Orchard Lane House within the past 2 years. I should also like to establish their respective positions regarding the inheritance. What precisely do they stand to gain from their uncle's demise? And most significantly, I should like to know whether either of them has demonstrated any particular interest in botanical matters, or whether they have been absent from their respective residences on dates that align with significant developments in this investigation. You think one of them poisoned your uncle? Garnish asked, his tone suggesting a mixture of excitement and concern at this development. I think, Whimsy corrected with meticulous precision, that we are beginning to perceive the outline of a crime considerably more complex than a simple poisoning. The oleander plants suggest premeditation spanning not weeks but months. Someone, presumably someone with reason to believe they would ultimately benefit from Ashford's death, undertook to cultivate the means of that death with patient deliberation. The arrival of the mysterious visitor yesterday afternoon represents what I suspect was a final catalyst, a piece of information that accelerated events to their conclusion. But the true architect of this affair is someone far more patient, far more calculating, and considerably more familiar with Ashford household than any London solicitor could possibly be. The nephew, when contacted by telephone at his London residence, proved to be a gentleman of approximately 35 years, possessed of that particular tone of voice that suggested he regarded the entire investigation as an inconvenient interruption to matters of considerably greater importance. His name was Charles Ashford, and he held a position in some banking establishment whose precise nature he seemed disinclined to elaborate upon. He confirmed that he had visited his uncle's house on precisely 2 occasions within the past 3 years, once at Christmas 2 years prior, and once during the summer of the previous year when he had been traveling through the county on business. Both visits had been brief, undertaken with the sort of filial obligation that suggested genuine affection was not a primary motivating factor. He expressed suitable shock at his uncle's death, though whimsy detected in his tone a certain calculating quality that suggested his thoughts were already turning toward the practical implications of his inheritance. The niece, Miss Eleanor Ashford, proved considerably more difficult to locate. She resided, according to the information provided by Mrs. Creel, in a cottage in Cornwall, where she had maintained a solitary existence for the past 5 years, following the dissolution of an engagement that no one in the household seemed willing to discuss in any detail. A telegram dispatched to her address received a response some 6 hours later, indicating that she would travel to Ashford in the Weald on the next available train, arriving the following morning. This information, when communicated to Whimsy, seemed to cause him a degree of satisfaction that suggested he had been anticipating this development with some certainty. It was Mrs. Creel, however, who provided the crucial piece of information that transformed the entire character of the investigation. Whimsy, in a seemingly casual conversation conducted in the kitchen while ostensibly examining the cocoa preparations once more, had inquired whether there had been any recent alterations to the household arrangements. New servants hired, existing servants dismissed, changes in routine or procedure. Mrs. Creel had initially indicated that nothing of significance had occurred, but then, with the sudden recollection that marks the human memory when properly prompted, she mentioned that approximately 18 months prior, a young woman had been engaged as a part-time assistant to manage certain aspects of the house's domestic affairs. Her name was Catherine Mills, and she was the daughter of a widow who lived in the village. She had worked for Mr. Ashford for approximately a year, handling correspondence, managing accounts, and generally assisting with those matters that occupied the household's administrative functions. However, she had departed her position some 4 months prior, having secured alternative employment in the county town. "Why did she leave?" Whimsy inquired, with an air of polite interest that barely concealed the intensity of his focus. Mrs. Creel seemed uncomfortable with this question. "There was some difficulty," she said finally. "Nothing scandalous, you understand, but Mr. Ashford seemed to feel that her continued presence in the household was problematic. He was quite kind about it, gave her a month's notice and a reference, but it was clear he wanted her gone. She left without causing any fuss, got work with a solicitor's office in town. Her mother was quite pleased about it, I believe. Better prospects, you see, working for a professional gentleman." This information prompted an immediate alteration to Whimsy's investigative strategy. Within 2 hours, a constable had been dispatched to the county town to locate Miss Catherine Mills and invite her, with appropriate courtesy, to provide a statement regarding her employment at Orchard Lane House. She proved to be a young woman of perhaps 23 years, possessed of a pale complexion and dark hair, arranged in a manner suggesting care with her appearance, though her eyes bore traces of what might charitably be described as chronic sadness. She was escorted to the library, a proceeding that caused Whimsy to raise an eyebrow, though he made no comment, and seated in an uncomfortable chair with the air of someone accustomed to finding herself in situations of considerable difficulty. "Miss Mills," Whimsy began, settling himself opposite her with the air of a man engaged in a casual social call rather than a criminal investigation, "I wonder whether you might illuminate certain aspects of Mr. Ashford's domestic arrangements during the period of your employment at Orchard Lane House. Specifically, I should like to know whether you observed anything unusual regarding his correspondence, his visitors, or his general conduct. Anything that might suggest he was preoccupied by matters of significance." Catherine Mills's hands twisted together in her lap with a degree of agitation that suggested this question had anticipated, something she had been both dreading and expecting. "I shouldn't say anything," she whispered. "I gave my word." "Your word to whom?" Whimsy inquired gently. There was a long silence, during which the young woman seemed to be engaged in some internal struggle of considerable magnitude. Finally, Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "To Miss Eleanor. She asked me to keep her confidence, and I gave my word as a matter of honor. But if Mr. Ashford is dead, then I suppose the matter has become rather academic." "Miss Eleanor Ashford," Wimsey prompted, though his expression suggested he had already divined the answer. "Yes, sir. She came to visit her uncle about 18 months ago. Quite unexpected it was, because Mr. Ashford hadn't seen her in years. They had some sort of quarrel in the library, quite heated from what I could hear through the door. Afterwards she asked to speak with me privately. She said her uncle had treated her terribly, that he had ruined her life by his actions many years ago, and that she had come to make him understand the consequences of his cruelty. She said she was going to stay in the village for a time, to observe him, to make him feel what she had felt. And she asked me to help her, to plant certain plants in the garden, to keep them tended, and most importantly, to say nothing to anyone. The confession, when it came, emerged in fragments punctuated by long silences, and the sort of emotional distress that suggested Catherine Mills had been carrying the burden of her knowledge with considerable difficulty. She had, she explained, been initially reluctant to assist Miss Eleanor in her proposed scheme, but she had been persuaded by a combination of factors: Eleanor's evident genuine distress regarding her uncle, Catherine's own youthful idealism regarding the concept of justice, and, perhaps most significantly, the financial remuneration that Eleanor had offered in exchange for her cooperation. The oleander plants had been obtained through a nursery in the neighboring county under a false name, delivered to a location remote from the village, and then transported to Orchard Lane House's garden during an evening when the household was otherwise occupied. Catherine had tended them faithfully, extracting the poison from the leaves at Eleanor's instruction and storing it in a small vial concealed within the cottage, where Eleanor had taken up temporary residence under an assumed name. She said she wanted him to feel fear, Catherine explained, her voice trembling with the effort of revelation. She said that he had caused her years of suffering through his actions, and that he deserved to experience uncertainty, to lie awake at night wondering whether he would die, wondering whether his sins had finally caught up with him. She never explicitly said she intended to actually administer the poison. I thought it was all theoretical, you understand. A threat, perhaps, meant to torment him, but not necessarily to be executed. Yet the poison was administered, Wimsey observed, his tone devoid of judgment, and Mr. Ashford is dead. At what point did Miss Eleanor's intentions become considerably more concrete? Catherine's face crumpled, and for a moment it appeared she might be unable to continue. 3 days ago, she said finally, Eleanor came to see me at the solicitor's office where I work. She was in a dreadful state, angry and upset and determined. She said her uncle had received a visitor, a gentleman from London, Anne. That this visitor had brought news that changed everything. She said her uncle intended to alter his will to ensure that she received nothing, because he had learned something about her that made him regard her with contempt rather than merely indifference. She said she had spent 18 months planning this, 18 months cultivating her revenge, and that she would not allow him to escape the consequences of his actions simply by rewriting his legal documents. Did she specify what this news from London concerned? Wimsey inquired. Catherine hesitated, clearly wrestling with the question of how much additional betrayal of Eleanor's confidence was warranted by the gravity of the circumstances. She said it concerned a woman in London named Margaret, and a child, Eleanor's half-brother, born of her uncle's relationship with this woman. The gentleman from London was apparently representing the child's interests, making claims against the estate. Eleanor said her uncle was planning to acknowledge the child and provide for him in his will at the expense of his legitimate heirs. She said this was the final proof of her uncle's moral bankruptcy, that he would provide for the bastard product of his illicit liaison, while denying his own niece the security that was rightfully hers. Wimsey rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the overgrown garden with an expression of profound contemplation. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality of sadness that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances of the case. "And where," he asked quietly, "is Miss Eleanor Ashford at present?" "I don't know, sir," Catherine replied. She left the office that afternoon and I haven't seen her since. But she told me that she was going to ensure her uncle consumed the poison that very evening. She said she had arranged for the preparat, ion that Cook had left to be replaced with her own concoction, and that by morning her uncle would be dead and her long ordeal would finally be concluded. The implications of this confession transformed the investigation from an intellectual exercise into a matter of considerable urgency. Garnish was immediately dispatched to telegraph the railway stations within a radius of 20 miles, requesting information regarding any female passengers matching Eleanor's description who had departed the area in the past 24 hours. Simultaneously, inquiries were initiated into Eleanor's temporary residence in the village, which proved to be a small cottage rented under the assumed name Miss E. Hartwell through an agency in the county town. The cottage, when examined, revealed itself to be a space organized with meticulous precision, containing correspondence, sketches of the oleander plants, detailed notes regarding poison preparation, and most damningly, a journal documenting Eleanor's emotional evolution from grief and anger through the careful articulation of her revenge scheme. The journal entries, which Whimsy examined with the focused intensity usually reserved for ancient manuscripts, revealed a portrait of a woman whose intelligence had been directed toward the systematic cultivation of her own vendetta. She had documented her research into her uncle's past, the discovery of the mysterious Margaret through correspondence discovered in his effects during her initial visit, and her subsequent investigations into the nature of her uncle's abandoned relationship. She had written at considerable length regarding the injustice of her own situation, her broken engagement, her exile to Cornwall, her years of solitude, and her conviction that these sufferings could be traced directly to her uncle's moral failings. Most significantly, however, the later entries revealed a progression from abstract revenge fantasy toward concrete planning, culminating in entries dated the previous day that spoke of the final necessary act and liberation through acknowledgement of truth. She has gone to ground, Whimsy said, with the certainty of a man who has reached conclusions based upon accumulated evidence and psychological insight. She will not flee the country. That would be the action of someone seeking merely to escape justice. Eleanor Ashford has committed an act she regards as righteous retribution, and she will not abandon the narrative she has constructed. Instead, I suspect she will position herself to observe the aftermath of her actions, to witness the revelation of her uncle's moral failings, and to accept the consequences of her deed as the price of justice rendered. Whimsy's prediction proved accurate with an almost theatrical precision that suggested he had divined not merely Eleanor's actions, but the very nature of her psychology. She was apprehended, not through any conventional police work, but rather through the simple expedient of remaining precisely where she had established her temporary residence. When Garnish and a constable arrived at the cottage under the name Miss E. Hartwell, they discovered her seated calmly at a desk, her correspondence organized, her affairs in order, and her expression bearing that peculiar quality of resignation, combined with defiant certainty that marks those who have committed terrible acts in the service of causes they regard as just. She made no attempt to flee, offered no resistance, and when informed of her rights and the charges against her, she merely nodded with the air of one receiving confirmation of something already anticipated. It was Whimsy, however, who requested the privilege of conducting the final interview, a proceeding that Garnish seemed inclined to regard with suspicion, though he ultimately acquiesced. The library at Orchard Lane House, the very room in which Richard Ashford had met his death, provided the setting for this confrontation. Eleanor was brought from her temporary detention, and she regarded Whimsy with an expression of mingled curiosity and defiance as he settled himself in the leather chair, the same chair in which her uncle had died, and gestured for her to be seated opposite. "You have, I suspect," Whimsy began, his tone carrying that quality of detached intellectual interest that characterized his approach to matters of genuine complexity, "prepared a narrative regarding your actions, Miss Ashford. A narrative that casts your uncle as a monster of moral bankruptcy and yourself as an instrument of justified retribution. I wonder whether you might elaborate upon this narrative, not for the benefit of the police, who have already obtained sufficient evidence for conviction, but rather for my own edification." I confess to a certain curiosity regarding the precise mechanisms by which a reasonably intelligent woman comes to convince herself that murder constitutes an acceptable response to past injuries. Eleanor's hands, which had been folded in her lap, tensed visibly at this question. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality of barely suppressed emotion that suggested Whimsy's characterization had struck at something fundamental in her self-conception. "You cannot possibly understand," she said. "You are a man, and men never understand what it means to have one's entire life destroyed by the casual indifference of someone in a position of power. My uncle ruined me, absolutely and completely ruined me, and he did so without a moment's genuine remorse." "Elaborate," Whimsy requested. "I confess I am not immediately cognizant of the precise manner in which your uncle accomplished this ruination." Eleanor rose from her chair. ND moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where the oleander plants still bloomed in their sheltered corner. "I was engaged to be married," she said quietly. "A good man, a kind man, someone who genuinely cared for my welfare. My uncle, in his infinite wisdom, took it upon himself to inform my fiancée of a certain family scandal, information that my uncle possessed regarding my mother's circumstances prior to her marriage. He did so ostensibly out of concern for the gentleman's welfare, to ensure he was not entering into a union with a woman whose lineage was tainted by indiscretion. The result was the immediate dissolution of the engagement, the utter destruction of my reputation within society, and the necessity of my exile to Cornwall to escape the gossip and contempt of those who had previously regarded me as respectable." "And your mother's circumstances," Whimsy inquired, "were they genuinely scandalous? Or merely the sort of ordinary human complication that marks every family's history?" "She was the daughter of a shopkeeper," Eleanor replied, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Nothing more. Perfectly respectable, perfectly appropriate for marriage to a gentleman of my father's standing. But my uncle chose to characterize it as something shameful, something that would irrevocably taint any woman descended from such a union. He weaponized family history, transformed it into an instrument of destruction, and shattered my life in the process. And when I finally confronted him about this, when I returned after 5 years of exile to demand answers, to force him to acknowledge what he had done, he merely looked at me with indifference and suggested that I should be grateful to him for having intervened, before I made a disastrous mistake." Whimsy was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful and composed. And then he said finally, "You discover the letters regarding Margaret, the woman with whom your uncle had maintained a clandestine relationship, the woman with whom he had fathered a child, the woman whose very existence contradicted every principle of moral rectitude that he had employed to justify his destruction of your life." "Precisely," Eleanor said, her voice acquiring a note of bitter triumph. "A man who had ruined my life on the basis of concerns regarding moral propriety and family reputation had himself engaged in the precise behavior he condemned in others. He had fathered a child outside of marriage, maintained a relationship hidden from society, and lived a double life characterized by the most profound hypocrisy. And I realized, as I sat there reading those letters, that he had never felt genuine remorse for what he had done to me. He had convinced himself that his actions had been justified, that he had been acting in my best interests, that he bore no responsibility for the consequences of his cruelty." "So you determined to kill him?" Whimsy observed, with a tone that was neither accusatory nor sympathetic, but rather clinically detached. "I determined," Eleanor corrected, her voice acquiring a quality of steely certainty, "to make him feel what I had felt, to place him in a position where he understood that his actions had consequences, where he experienced the fear of losing everything, where his carefully constructed respectability was threatened with exposure. I spent 18 months planning this, 18 months cultivating the means of his destruction. And when I finally acted, I did so not merely as revenge, but as an act of justice, making him understand in his final moments that the universe does not tolerate such profound hypocrisy indefinitely. Yet your uncle," Whimsy said quietly, "never consumed the poison of his own volition. Someone replaced the cocoa that cook ha. Prepared, someone substituted the deadly preparation for the innocent beverage. Someone, in fact, made the decision that your uncle should die. And while I suspect you would claim responsibility for that act, I wonder whether you would also claim responsibility for ensuring that the wrong person did not consume the poison in his stead, for ensuring that no innocent individual fell victim to your carefully orchestrated scheme. Eleanor's expression underwent a subtle alteration at this observation, a flicker of something, uncertainty perhaps, or belated recognition of an implication she had not previously considered. "I was careful," she said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "I ensured that only my uncle would consume the preparation. I replaced the cocoa myself after the household had settled for the evening. I knew his habits perfectly. He took his cocoa at precisely 9 o'clock, after his correspondence. No one else in the household consumed cocoa at that hour. The preparation was intended solely for him. And yet," Whimsy continued, rising from his chair and moving to stand beside her at the window, "you did not actually administer the poison yourself, did you? You prepared it, you cultivated the means, you orchestrated the circumstances. But the final act, the moment at which your uncle consumed the substance that would terminate his existence, that moment was not within your direct control. Someone else entered this library on the night of his death. Someone else replaced the cocoa. Someone else ensured that your uncle would drink from his best spode cup rather than the plain white cup that cook had prepared." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression now bearing traces of genuine alarm. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Whimsy said with deliberate precision, "that you were not acting alone in this matter. That there was a party involved. Someone who shared your conviction that Richard Ashford deserved death, someone who possessed their own reasons for desiring his demise, someone who saw in your carefully prepared scheme an opportunity to accomplish their own ends. I am suggesting, in fact, that your elaborate revenge plot was appropriated and brought to its conclusion by someone you trusted, someone you confided in, someone who used your poison and your careful planning to achieve purposes entirely distinct from your own." The color drained from Eleanor's face with such visible rapidity that Whimsy moved quickly to ensure she did not collapse. "Who?" she whispered. "Who are you suggesting?" "Charles," Whimsy replied, with the tone of a man confirming something already obvious. "Your cousin Charles, the nephew who stood to inherit the entirety of his uncle's estate, at least until the mysterious visitor from London arrived bearing news of an illegitimate child who now possessed superior claims. Charles, who visited this house during the summer of the previous year, and who would have observed your activities in the garden. Charles, who learned of your scheme through some indiscretion or inadvertent revelation, and who recognized in it an opportunity to accomplish his own purposes without bearing direct responsibility for the deed. He did not need to know the details of your poison, merely that you had arranged for your uncle to consume something lethal. He simply ensured that the exchange would be made, that his uncle would indeed drink the fatal preparation, and that the investigation would inevitably focus upon the obvious suspect, the resentful niece with a motive rooted in years of accumulated grievance. Eleanor sank into her chair, her composure shattered utterly. "But he couldn't have known. I was so careful." "You were careful regarding the poison itself," Whimsy acknowledged. "DG dead. But you were not careful regarding the revelation of your intentions to others. Catherine Mills knew of your scheme. Catherine Mills, who worked in his London office, who may well have mentioned your activities to her current employer. A solicitor, perhaps, or someone connected to the legal profession who had access to Charles Ashford's London address. Charles Ashford, who had everything to gain from his uncle's immediate death, and nothing to gain from an extended investigation into the circumstances of that death. The arrival of the mysterious visitor yesterday afternoon merely accelerated matters. Charles realized that his uncle intended to provide for his illegitimate offspring, and he determined to act with urgency. Whimsy returned to the leather chair, settling himself with the air of a man concluding a particularly tedious lecture. "The question that now demands answering, Miss Ashford, is whether you are willing to testify regarding the full extent of your cousin's involvement in this affair. Whether you are willing to acknowledge that your carefully orchestrated revenge was transformed, without your knowledge or consent, into an instrument for his financial gain. The evidence against you is substantial, the journal, the cocoa preparation, the testimony of Miss Mills. But the evidence against Charles, when combined with your account of the matter, would be considerably more damning. You may, if you choose, protect him through silence, or you may choose to ensure that your uncle's death results not merely in your imprisonment, but in the exposure of the man who exploited your emotions and your carefully laid plans to serve his own mercenary purposes. Eleanor remained silent for a long moment, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Finally, with a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak, revealing the conversation she conducted with Charles during his visit to the village, the oblique references she had made to her revenge scheme, the manner in which he had seemed suddenly interested in her activities after years of indifference. She described how he had suggested that her plan was quite clever, really, how he had asked detailed questions about the poison's mechanism of action, how he had inquired with specific interest regarding the precise timing of her uncle's cocoa consumption. By the time Eleanor's confession had been completed, Whimsy had already risen and moved toward the door. He paused at the threshold, regarding her with an expression of mingled pity and intellectual satisfaction. "You sought to punish your uncle for his hypocrisy," he said quietly, "but in doing so you provided your cousin with the perfect instrument for his own ambitions. In attempting to render judgment upon moral failings, you became yourself an unwitting accomplice to a far more straightforward crime, simple, calculated murder for profit. I wonder whether you will find any consolation in that reflection during the years ahead."